Welcome everyone, in person and online, to our event today on the theme of global cooperation in times of geopolitical strife. I should say that the main attraction for the event is Sir Paul Tucker, who has written a phenomenal book on that subject called Global Discord, Values and Power in a Fractured World Order. And this is the sort of book that hits many bases, as they would say in America. First, it is a really impressive historical treatise, and even if you just read the book for its history of political thought and international law and the genesis of today's international institutions, that alone would be worth the read. But of course, the book goes further. It actually, and very ambitiously, I think, applies this history and the political thought that is behind it to today's problems, and not just to one of today's problems, but to two. One having to do with the legitimacy of international organizations today, and the other with the ability of international organizations and cooperation and delegation through them to survive the much tenser geopolitical setting in which we now find ourselves in. So as many of you know, I was working in the strategy department of the IMF until I joined Bruegel as the director in September, and the sorts of things that the book thinks about were very much things that we were discussing at that time, but without the rigor, without the historical background of Paul's book. I should introduce Paul for those that don't know him. He was the deputy governor of the Bank of England until late 2013. That's how he became famous, I would say. He was also a very key figure in the Basel Committee on Banking supervision, even though he insists that Basel II is not his fault. And he has since then been a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, where he has written two important books. The first one, Unelected Power, coming out, I think, in 2018, is that correct? And taking up some of the same legitimacy themes as this book, but applied to national independent institutions. And this is the big book on the international front. We have then two really outstanding discussants. The first one is Rosa Balfour, who is the director of the Carnegie Europe Center and a very distinguished scholar in the field of international relations. And we are, for the most part, on the panel a bunch of economists who, possibly with the exception of Paul, who has been now studying the issue at depth for many years, are somewhat insecure on applying these ideas to the international system. And so it's good to have a professional among us, and we were looking forward to Rosa's comments on that front. And finally, there's our very own André Shapir, senior fellow at Bruegel, who of course has thought about geoeconomics and geopolitical issues himself from the vantage mainly of trade policy. So what we will do is have first Paul present the book. It's hard to summarize a 500-page book in 15 to 20 minutes, but he will try. Then we will give the word to Rosa as the first discussant, and then to André. Please, Paul. Go ahead. Can we have the slides up, please?
Chairman, thank you very, very much for inviting me to be here. And it's the first time I've been here since you became the boss. And it's a fantastic appointment, if I may say so. Bruegel is by far the best economic think tank in this time zone. And you are a worthy successor to your two terrific predecessors. Thanks to all of you and for those online for giving up your time. Thanks enormously to Rosa for agreeing to be a panelist. There's a little bit of exaggeration in this, but it's much easier for someone like me, given who I used to be, to attract the interest of people that think of themselves as doing economics or economic policy or even political science than it is to engage with people that do security. And if anything, I'm more interested in engaging with people that do security and foreign affairs these days, for reasons I hope to explain, than my old world. But it's also fantastic to have Andre here. Andre was a great help to me in writing this book. He read two chapters, the chapter on trade and the chapter on cross-border investment in draft, with where the main request was, whether you agree or not, please just point out the things that I've got horribly wrong. And you were really fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to say something about the structure of the book in case any of you buy it or get it from the library or whatever, partly to indicate where I'm going to pick up in the book. The book structure, and I can barely read this slide, by the way, is essentially, perhaps if I look that way, it starts, this is not the way it's structured physically, it's the way it's structured analytically. It starts with an account of the legitimacy of institutions, including interstate institutions. It takes that into an account of international political theory, which departs a bit from the mainstream. It takes that with some geopolitics grafted on top to an account of international relations, which certainly departs from the mainstream. From that, it derives some principles for cooperation between states, including in international organizations. That's the end of the argument of the book. The book is one argument up to that point, and then it applies it to trade, monetary affairs, cross-border investment, and finance, partly just to show that the principles can be applied, that they're not left hanging in the air, but also partly because I can claim to know something about at least some of the areas where I apply the principles. I think this is defended in the book, but a backdrop belief of mine, not a recent belief, is that the contest between the West and the People's Republic will go on for a long century. That this isn't something that's going to be over any time soon, and that's something that should weigh in the strategy of the main Western capitals. It's common to compare what's going on, partly because of the Thucydidean trap literature, of the challenge that the Second German Reich presented to my country at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. I don't think it's quite like that. Obviously, it's like that in some respects. I think it's actually rather more like the contest between France and Britain from the late 17th century to the early 19th century, the long 18th century. In perhaps two respects. First of all, that contest was everywhere and in everything. It was in international commerce all over the world, as well as a kind of military contest. It ebbed and flowed. There were periods of accommodation. There was an attempt, I think they even signed it, to reach a trade treaty in the middle of the 18th century. That got displaced by another war, and they didn't actually get back to that point until the 1860s. But most of all, I think that the struggle was about, certainly from the perspective of my country, it was about types of power. So at the beginning of so this is perspectival. France had an objection to my country. From Britain's point of view, at the beginning of the 18th century, the problem was the universalist claims of absolute monarchy. At the end of the 18th century, my country's problem with France were the universalist claims of revolution. Burke said during that period, the problem isn't France's power, it's the wrong kind of power. So analogies are never exact, but I think essentially that is the tension that is going to exist for a long time between a party-dominated People's Republic. The points are all about the party, they're not about the Chinese people or Chinese civilization. And a Western world that is constitutionalist, democratic in some degree, rule of law-ish in some degree, and that's very, very different. And a key thing about this is that lots of people will say, and I think they're broadly right, but it's quite likely that the People's Republic will stumble at some time over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, maybe next week. And because of the kind of various vulnerabilities in its financial system and economy. And that could happen. And if and might not, but if it does, I think a lot of people in the West, particularly in the States, will say, well, that's it then. That's back to normal. We rule the world. And people in Europe will say, well, we can stop being nervous about China. We can get back to making money out of China. And I basically think that's wrong. China has critical mass that even if it has a bad decade, at the end of that decade, it will be a powerful country, able to afford a vast military, and if it chooses to challenge us, it may choose not to, but if it is going to be capable of choosing us. The book has 4 scenarios: lingering status quo, superpower struggle, new Cold War, new world order. I'll come back to them right at the end. When I started writing the book, I thought we were between, which is about 3-4 years ago, I thought we were between lingering status quo and superpower struggle. With one area accepted, I think we're now basically between superpower struggle and new Cold War. I don't think we will get to a reshaped world order until other states like India, conceivably Indonesia, basically any country with a large population with the capacity to grow rapidly for a few decades. That will need to happen, I think, before we get to a truly reshaped world order. I'll say just one or two things about the international political theory and international relations. So this is going to be put in a slightly exaggerated way, given the time. So international relations faculties work on the basis that it's as though at the end of your course of studies, you're asked to go to a room, and in that room you're told whether you're going to be a Hobbesian whose life is devoted to thinking about power and the cynical use of power to preserve your own state, or whether you're going to be a Kantian who thinks that reasoning with a capital R to norms and values is the important thing, and you should spend your life thinking about human rights treaties and organizations and violations, or whether you're going to be a Grotian, who will be familiar around here, who thinks it's somehow to do with interdependence and interlinkages, and then you'll be interested in international organizations and economic cooperation and so on. And the book doesn't take any of those routes. It's in the image of David Hume. If a policymaker is asked the question, which of the following do you think matters? Power, interests, or values? They'll say, all of them. So actually you need, I claim, you need an international political theory that can cater for all three without marginalizing one or other of them. And I'm not going to say how I do that, but I draw on David Hume and the late 20th century philosopher Bernard Williams and some mechanism design economics to do that. The premise of the book, this is kind of obviously true, but neglected in the policy world, and I think in the academic world for quite a long time, is that any kind of cooperation relies on a precondition of there being order and safety and trust, which create the conditions for cooperation. In the world, I guess there are two ways of maintaining peaceful coexistence. One is a hegemon, a security hegemon. We've kind of lived with that for the last 30 years, or alternatively a balance of power. We're probably in a transition away from American hegemony to some kind of balance of power. And the key thing is, to the extent that international cooperation and specifically international regimes and organizations are made in the image or constrained by whatever sustains order, then as the order changes, we should expect the rising state and others to demand changes in the way that we cooperate in the world, crucially in the main international organizations. And I think that's where we are. To the extent all of that is true, the book tries to argue this carefully. The norms that are important are the norms that are held most dearly by the dominant powers who provide security in the world, which for the last 70 years has been us. Some kind of expansive Europe led by the United States. And the norms we have, of course, are partly the product of our own history, the problems and opportunities that we faced, including some of the horrors that occurred in our part of the world as well as elsewhere. China has a different history, and it has different governing norms that precede the emergence of the party. And therefore the contest between us is kind of really deep about how to organize a political society. I'll say something a bit more about this in a second, but chapter 9 has a whole series of quotes from recent major figures in China, and they're quite striking in their difference from our way of thinking about how to govern a political society. But I want to stress that although this has a kind of flavor of civilizational difference, I don't think ultimately it is. I emphasize this in the book without debating it at length. I mean, I think Confucian heritage states that have become, in some degree, constitutional democracies, so South Korea and Japan most notably, are incredibly important because they haven't given up their histories, they haven't given up their traditions. Anyone that's been to Japan knows that Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples and Confucian modes are still a very important part of their life, even more so in some respects in South Korea. And yet they are constitutional democracies in Korea. There have been true power shifts between genuine different distinct parties. I think that's tremendously important in emphasizing that this isn't about people from the Far East. Now, so here's something more concrete. Now, when I was in office, I used to do hands up, which is very irritating, but I haven't lost that habit. Who has heard of Document 9 from the People's Republic? Had any of you three heard of Document 9? No, nor had I before I stumbled on it. So Document 9 was leaked or somehow released from the Central Committee in Beijing in 2013. And it lays out the 7 no's. And the 7 no's are all saying no's to kind of threats to the regime. So no to constitutional democracy, no to civil society, no to a free press, no to a fully marketized economy, and no to Western-style nihilism. It's a tremendously articulate document in terms of what China does not stand for. And one kind of stark way of putting it, slightly overstated, is they do not stand for what we stand for. Or they certainly do not stand for what I kind of would be prepared to die for in certain circumstances, although I'm too old to be useful in any of that. So what does this have to do with cooperation? I think one way of putting it, and the way I do put it, is we will be able to cooperate more with those with whom we have most in common and fear least. So this is a world of concentric circles. And China will have its own set of concentric circles. This is perspectival. In the outermost circle, the priority is peaceful existence, trying to cooperate on truly global existential threats, and trying to find conventions to trade that don't jeopardize our security and ways of life. If you move in a circle, and I define the next circle as the circle of states that live by and do not violate the peremptory norms of international law, so the norms against genocide and slavery and torture and so on, really, really appalling things that trump everything else in international law. Well, with them, we can be a little bit more relaxed about overdependence, a little bit more relaxed about security. And then as you move inwards, as you have more and more in common, then you can do more and more together. The European Union is an example of this. Andre and I are co-authors of a paper with Jean Pisani-Ferry and Guntram Wolff. It's 4 of us, yes? 5. Oh, no, of course, and Norbert Röttgen, yes. Of a Europe of concentric circles, essentially in the context of Brexit, which is, as it happens, I still think is where the world will end up in about 30 years' time. So you can pick up the concentric circles at any level. The practical challenge that this presents is, so what on earth do you do with the existing organizations and corporations? The book sets out some kind of high principles of policy, which is avoid wishful thinking. I think the United States and to some extent Europe indulged in wishful thinking about China, both when designing the WTO and in particular when allowing the terms on which they allowed China into the WTO, prepared to defend that later on. Try to minimize the maximum damage from plausible worst case scenarios. It's kind of what economists call minimax or robustness. Try and ensure that systems, this goes for security as well as finance and economics, are resilient. And this, of course, means that there can't be silos in policy. I was a public servant for over 3 decades. And these were 3 decades where actually you could be a monetary policy maker and really not know very much about trade policy. You have to know something about trade economics, for sure. You didn't need to know about trade policy. And if you did know about trade policy as well as monetary policy and financial policy, you didn't need to know very much about Rosa's world at all. That's over. This is more like my predecessors in the 1970s, more like people like Paul Volcker. And I have a story about Saudi Arabia on that, which we may come to under Q&A. The book sets out some concrete principles for international cooperation. One is, don't enter into agreements that are going to threaten your local order or plausibly threaten your local order or the legitimacy of your form of government. Secondly, this is very important to trade, liberal states should have a bias towards universalism in international regimes, but without constraining coalitions of the willing going further. Think regional trade pacts nested under the WTO. And the third one I want to emphasize today is don't inadvertently give too much power, the decisive voice in power, by which I mean high policy, to judges and the leaders of international organizations. How many minutes have I got left?
Oh my God. Been a bad chair. About 2.
Okay, I'll say one thing about trade and I'll say one thing about the monetary system. So the thing about the trade system, and it's absolutely encapsulated in the subsidies case where the appellate board of the WTO decided that it was okay for Chinese state-owned enterprises to subsidize exports, and therefore it would be illegal under the treaty for the US to employ countervailing measures. And this is all slightly balmy in the sense that, of course, in a party-led state, the state-owned enterprises or anybody else are a manifestation of state policy. That's just how things work in the People's Republic. But the more important thing is that it is what you would expect, certainly in a parliamentary system or government, a bit less so in a US-style government. If you get some court decision, a Supreme Court decision that you don't like very much about ordinary law, and that's it in terms of the backward-looking case. In the forward-looking case, you tweak the high-level policy via parliamentary law and move on. In the international field, this would be equivalent to there being a bargaining session. Case comes out, China loves it, America hates it, Europe doesn't much like it either. What one would expect then to happen is there be some kind of bargaining process where the key parties get to some equilibrium that they can live with. This cannot work in the WTO because everybody has a veto. So if you think about the consequence of everyone having a veto, so I am now speaking as an ex-policymaker, it means that when you draft the treaty, you think you have done the perfect job. This, of course, is absurd. No decent policymaker ever thinks it is finished. Or alternatively, you think that nothing important is ever going to happen, and in particular, no power is going to rise which has a different perspective on the world, including how to organize the world economy. That's the bit that's wishful. That's the bit that's wishful thinking. And so it's an inevitability, as I see it, and this isn't going to go away soon, that a lot of the action in trade will be in regional trade agreements of the kind represented by the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Let me now say something finally about the international monetary system. The thing about the international monetary system is the advantage of issuing the dominant reserve currency. And people normally say, and they're right to say, well, this means that the currency issuer for decades, the United States, they can borrow more cheaply, their banks have an advantage, there's a kind of an annuity advantage to them. And that's true, and crucially, that makes it cheaper than otherwise to be the security hegemon. Something else is also true, though, which hadn't really occurred to me until I saw it in 2007. So the US financial incompetence and mendacity blows up the world. And what you'd expect in any other country, certainly any country in Europe, is in those circumstances, their currency would fall and bond yields, the cost of government borrowing, would rise. What happened, in fact, is that there was a flow of funds, rush of funds, into short-term treasury bonds as the safest asset in the world. As America blew up the world, America could borrow more cheaply to help the world recover from its own mistakes. This is the point about this is you put those two things together, and any rising state would probably aspire to be in that position. But the connection to security goes further than that it's cheaper. Security relationships also foster use of the dollar, or in the past, sterling. And actually, I'll tell this story now. So in the 1970s, when Watergate, Vietnam, civil fracture, so America's in a bad place, and then the Bretton Woods regime collapses. There's a marvelous moment when President Nixon has presided over a new monetary regime called the Smithsonian, which he declares to be the greatest monetary system in the history of the world, but it only lasted about 6 weeks as it happened. What then happens is chaos for about 15 years, in the midst of which a delegation goes from, I think, the State Department and the Treasury Department to Saudi Arabia, and basically does a bargain where we, the United States, will continue to provide you with security help, but actually on a bigger scale than in the past, and you must promise to continue invoicing oil in dollars. And those kind of tiny things, and that generation of policymakers, they understood the links between security, trade, money, and if they were alive today, environmental stuff. My generation of policymakers did not understand those links because we didn't need to. The current generation of policymakers needs to learn from that older generation, not from mine. And I've got one final slide, which is where we are at the moment, is in the monetary field, we are in a lingering status quo. But in everything else, we are between superpower struggle and new Cold War. And there's a hazard as we seek to try to avoid dangerous overdependence. How do we avoid that tipping over into kind of uncontrolled protectionism that pushes the world economy into a desperate depression? So the stakes are high. Thank you, Jeremy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. We hand over to Rosa.
Thank you very much. And, thank you very much. And listening to Paul, all sorts of additional points came to my mind, but I'll try to stick to the few notes that I made on my post-its and leave the rest perhaps for the discussion. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. And I share the same appetite for engaging with people who come from different disciplines. I think it's absolutely fundamental. And I think I'm not alone in this. But we're really at the very first stages. I mean, I've always tried to do a lot through my work, reach out to people working on other disciplines, migration policy, environmental studies. And I've always found it's actually quite difficult to do, and I think it's even more difficult in policy because we speak different languages, so it's really important to start that. So let me just say, first of all, I really enjoyed the book. It has a huge, the breadth is impressive. Don't think you can skim read it because it's very dense, and it's also ambitious, but it really does push several buttons for thinking, and it brought me back to IR theory and introduced me to Bernard Williams, whom I didn't actually know, so I've got a little yellow post-it which means look it up, so I'll be doing that. And it does, one of the things that I commend about this book is that it really does look at history, international relations theory, philosophy, economics. So it really tries to do that cross-pollinization that we are all trying to do but struggling to do. And I think if you think about the polycrisis and the failures in addressing the polycrisis in this city over the past 15 years, a lot of it is actually due to an inability to look at the polycrisis in its complexity. It's been looked at through, be it Eurozone, be it economic governance, be it a problem of austerity policies or a problem of austerity that then causes identity politics to rise. Each issue has been addressed in their silos, whereas actually it is the complexity and the relationship between each of these issues that gives you the full picture and therefore potentially tools to solve them. I also think it's very relevant in the EU context. I think the EU is better placed than a lot of other governments to address complexity because it is so hybrid and because it has the advantage of not being entirely dominated by electoral cycles. So you can have a bureaucracy that is looking at cross-generational issues in a long-term frame. So if you look at the debates that I've been following for the past couple of decades on Europe's foreign relations, there is a lot of discussion on the topics, on the issues on the concepts that you raise, power, democracy, security, legitimacy, but it's very much in the foreign policy domain. But given that the EU has developed its foreign policy as a whole of government approach, they've really tried to be holistic, and I'm using EU jargon here, and using different tools from trade to aid to security to partnerships. This has all been done, but there still are a lot of blind spots, and I think this book helps us address them. The second reason I'd like to commend this book for, I make no, I'm not summarizing it in any way, and I'm just picking on a couple of points because, as I said, it's very dense. But the second reason, it's actually, for me, it's nearly banal, but I think it needs to be said. A differentiation between geoeconomics and geopolitics. Because in this town in particular, there has been a lot of talk about the EU becoming a geopolitical actor without explaining exactly what it is, and there's no impression that there is a real understanding of what that actually means. Whereas actually, what they're really talking about is geoeconomics. And it's really important to make that distinction because they're two quite separate issues, and there's a nice definition in the book, and which I will summarize as geoeconomics is foreign policy through economic tools. It's not only about geopolitics. Geopolitics is something different and rests on different assumptions about actorness and the subjects of international relations. So this is, as I said, quite a banal point, but I think it's worth making because I think in this town often there's a lot of confusion and a bit of intellectual laziness on this front, in the narratives, in the rhetoric, in the speeches that we listen to. What I'd like to do is, because this is the book is global, it has a historical breadth that goes back to, well, you actually start from the beginning, right? So it doesn't what I'd like to do is take some of the concepts that you address and just try to sink them into an EU context, if that's okay, because therefore sort of, bridging a bit the sort of abstract theoretical with what we do in a daily basis. But I am still going to be, broad brushed rather than go into the nitty gritty. So, as I said, there's this combination of geopolitics and geoeconomics, but then there's a very strong focus, and I'm going to pull out, I think, three concepts that I appreciated. One is the concept of power, the concept of norms, values, and the other is the concept of legitimacy. And I think what we're seeing, and I'd like to just try to think about them in the context of what's happening now, which I think is potentially a transformation period for the European Union. And it needs to think about power, legitimacy, and values very hard, because that will form the basis of what, at some point, might become the new world order. And even though we might not be there, someone has to start thinking about it to have the idea of what it might look like. And I think we need to do that. So we're seeing today several shifts. The debates today are about the Inflation Reduction Act and how to respond to it. Of course, there's Russia's war in Ukraine. There is the US-China rivalry. And this is accelerating a certain kind of debate that pre-existed that, and was, recently accelerated by Brexit in the first instance, where we saw the single market pull out its hard power, and also, of course, by Trump. But I think probably we'll see, if we wanted to look at continuities, we'll find some earlier. And I think what we're seeing is an increasing politicization of tools that, until very recently, were described and thought of as technocratically led tools managed by powers delegated to a supranational body, therefore essentially depoliticized. Now, the truth is that, of course, this is a partial truth. It wasn't pure depoliticization, and it wasn't pure technocracy. But the single market and trade have been run with a level of permissive consensus, which is quite extraordinary. And that is where the EU's power actually lies. And this is increasingly being politicized for foreign policy reasons. And this raises a huge number of questions from the foreign policy perspective, a huge number of dilemmas. If you are to use international norms as your basis for engagement with third countries, how do you then justify politicizing the tools through which you're trying to pursue those goals? If you are arguing for multilateralism as the best framework for managing international relations, if you start politicizing, you're looking at interests and whose interests you are pursuing. And so how do you square the circle between European interests and, the rhetoric, economic sovereignty, technological sovereignty, strategic autonomy? How do you square that with the values of multilateralism that the EU had embraced, again, rhetorically, and the reality is always grayer, shadier, and fuzzier than the rhetoric. But how do you square that? How do you reach out to partners, for instance, to India, to persuade India that a vision of the New World Order is perhaps, it needs to be developed together, when actually you're pursuing, your hard interest in, subsidizing your, industrial policy, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of dilemmas that are rooted around the politicization of tools. The second is, of course, that the EU is securitizing emerging fields, technology, artificial intelligence, all those fields where, semiconductors, all those fields where the geopolitics of it is increasingly evident, but where the EU, from the economic point of view, and from the technological point of view, and from the point of view of innovation, is actually quite weak, and needs to be flexible about how to address these issues. And the third dimension to this is that if you had the EU's economy and the EU's economic powerhouse developed in a way that was, as I said, delegated to the Brussels institutions with permissive consensus. And then you need to change that bargain at a time in which the EU itself is politically contested. What kind of social bargain are you going to bring in? So if you're going to bring economics into the field of international politics, you need to handle it differently because you have the domestic question that is more pressing. And I think this is the set of dilemmas that the EU finds itself in at the moment. As I said, it's a period, I think, of transition. Just looking at it from the EU perspective, it's also from the global perspective, it's a time, it's a time of discord, of conflict. We don't really know where things are going to go. But in the EU, it certainly is a time of transition. And while there have been recent discoveries that actually the EU can do certain things in a more hard-nosed way, there are a whole, COVID, Brexit, Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. But at the same time, there are a whole set of other issues about what is the social contract, the social and political contract that binds the EU together. And the book it has a very interesting section on incentives for coordination, cooperation, etc. And of course, the EU is the highest level of cooperation that exists. But if you're going to change the terms of the bargain, you need to address those too. I think that's covering more or less what I wanted to say.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Andre, please.
Thanks. Great pleasure to participate in this panel. As you said, Paul, I had read and commented with great pleasure the 2 chapters that you sent me, and we had very active exchanges during that time. But reading the book was really something completely different, because indeed the chapters, they are on the low road, as you call them in the book, the high road and the low road. There's a very high road, very dense, but very, very fascinating and really very intellectual, but very helpful in trying to think, for people such as me, really sort of giving a completely new horizon, thinking of some of those issues. So really enjoyed reading the book. One would need to spend a day really to discuss many of the questions there. What I want to do, in a sense, I do want to talk about around the topic of China, and not only because I had written this book with Petros on that, but because in a sense it is the subject which is looming very much at every corner of the book, sometime explicitly, sometime implicitly, sort of us and China. Now, when I contemplate, the 21st century and with the historical lens, I see 2 major global challenges. And that's what I want to talk. I want to talk of those 2 challenges, and then at the very end put them together and ask a question. Now, the first challenge is what I would call the re-emergence of China and India as economic powers or even superpowers. Up to, as we all know, up to the middle of the 19th century, each of them, China and India, accounted for a quarter of world GDP. Together, 50% of world GDP. Now, that share started to decline very, very sharply in the second half of the 19th century, with the rise of new countries and the decline of China and India also, but the rise of new countries, including the United States, obviously, Germany and Japan. And roughly the lowest point of China and India in sort of their history is roughly around 1950. They accounted for, maybe together 2% of world GDP, and then they started to sort of creep up and increase. But by the end of the 20th century, let's say in 2000, together they're only 5% of world GDP. 5%. China and India, the two most popular countries in the world, 5% of GDP. Now today, 2023, numbers from 2021, together they account for 21% of GDP, of which China alone is 18. It's 18 for China, 3% for India. And certainly one of the turning points was the reforms implemented in China, and then the entry of China in the WTO in 2001. That was really then what accelerated. There is the domestic reform, and then it creates the condition together with entry into the WTO to grow very, very rapidly. Now, this rapid change, incredibly rapid change, and on a huge scale, it was bound to create clashes with established powers, with us, right? What you call us. The US, Europe, the G7. What I use some G7 plus, sort of, plus Australia and maybe South Korea and New Zealand. Now, us here, the G7 plus, we account still today, we account in 2000 for 65% of world GDP. Then, when China started to, we are still together, we are still at 50%. But it was bound to create clashes. I mean, nothing of that sort. China re-emerging, maybe soon India as well, on a big scale. India is re-emerging, but maybe it will be much, much bigger. I mean, that was bound to create huge clashes. So in a sense, we should not be surprised. That in itself would have deserved a book. But obviously, there is much more to it. Right? There's much more to China than this. Otherwise, in a sense, the story that we would be telling here is Japan. Okay? Because we are Japan. Japan, at the peak of Japan, Japan is 16% of world GDP. At the peak. Until conflict with the US, 80s, 90s, and then the decline for all kinds of reasons, external and internal. Okay? But in a sense, it could have been a story like rivalry between the US and Japan, right? Rivalry between the US and China. And it was not easy with Japan, but it happened. So Japan declined. And China noticed that, obviously, what happened. How it reached a summit, 16%, and how it declined. No, various reasons, demographic, there's not just the US. I mean, there are many, many issues. But China clearly observed also its demography. Now, two, I think, major differences between China and Japan. One is the economic system. Okay? When Japan enters into the GATT, just like when China enters in the WTO, China is not welcome, except by the United States. It's certainly not welcomed by European countries. It says, Japan, this is not a country that belongs to the GATT. It's not in the club. It's a completely different country. It doesn't play the same rules of the game as we do. Plus, it's threatening us, potentially. So the Europeans say, no, we don't. The US, for geopolitical reasons, says, no. Japan needs to be inside the club. Now, and obviously the US prevails. But soon enough, Japan does become a rival, and problems start. But in the meantime, Japan has become one of us. Becomes a member of the OECD, and it does really become one of us. No, maybe China will become one day one of us. But certainly it has not so far. Okay, so it has a different I'm talking still economics. It has a different economic system, and that does create issues that was not there with Japan, not for very, very long. But then there is a second dimension, which is the geopolitics. Now, big difference between China and Japan. World War II. Japan obviously was on the losing side of World War II. Japan was occupied by the US. Not the same relationship in military terms than China. So China, yes, China today is clearly a rising economic and geopolitical, more bluntly, military power. And yes, it is what the US, I mean, at least from the US viewpoint, it is a strategic rival. Japan was never a strategic rival, it was an economic rival. Okay? And it was handled in some manner. Now, had the clash been only economic, one may have hoped that the difficult fact that China does have a different economic system and how we deal with that in the WTO. You know, WTO, liberal system, China, different economic system. I think one could have dealt with it. I think that's what our book was about with Petros, you know, how to deal with that. The problem is that, you know, it's not the logic of positive sum game of trade and economics that applies into this. It's the logic of geopolitics and therefore much more complicated. Now, does it mean, and that's a question, that's my first question to you, are we headed for a two-tier system? Sometime, sort of, you know, between the lines, I read a bit, you know, cooperation, but an outer circle. Does it mean, sort of, in a sense, not a full member of the WTO? Different rules apply to China, or some have even discussed the fact that, you know, we recreate a new WTO without China. So is that, you know, ideal what we want? My view is that this two-tier system, it's not feasible. Whether it's desirable is a different question. It's not feasible. I counted, and I won't show the slides, I counted 56 entities today, including the EU, by the way, and the US, for which China is either the first market or the first source of imports. For a number of countries, it's both first export market and first source. 56 countries, including 6 of the 8 G7 plus. The only 2 that are not is Canada and the UK. Okay? China is not number 1 on one side or number 1 on the other. It's number 2, but not number 1. But for all the others, it is. Okay? No, 56 countries to draw the line and to say, you know, no, China is out of the system and two-tier system. I think it's not feasible. You give me 1 minute, I come to my second point, and I will conclude, again from a historical viewpoint. We have been talking here about geopolitics and moving from, you know, positive sum game of trade and economics to zero-sum game of power and geopolitics. But there is the second issue of the 21st century, and that's a first. The other one can discuss, you know, what we had in the 19th century, the rise of Germany, and I know you don't like this, you know, the rise of Germany and Japan, you know, whether it's something similar what we have now, the clashes with China, but there's a completely different problem on top of that, the climate. Climate we did not have in the 19th century in the concert of nations and, you know, all the geopolitical fight. Climate, there we cannot discuss whether we are going to solve this by confrontation or by cooperation. Okay? We can discuss trade, you know, what is the solution? What is the solution of the emerging countries? You know, can we handle them with confrontation, with cooperation? Climate, there's only one way, cooperation. If you don't do cooperation, you just won't solve the problem. You know, I said that China now is nearly 20% of world GDP. It's 30% of emissions. Us, the G7, we are 50% of world GDP, we are also 30% of emissions. 30% China, 30% us, who is the other 40%? The global south, obviously. So how do we deal with this? And I finish with this. You know, if those are the two major problems, one is how the system functions with the emergence or re-emergence of China, India, in particular China, with a different values, different economic system. You know, how do we deal with this? Do we deal with this with sort of separating, putting a dividing line, sort of a Cold War kind of scenario? Okay, one can discuss this. Do we do that there for trade? But then we have this other problem where we need to cooperate. Can we separate the two, those two spheres? I hear that, right? Some people say that's their view. No problem. In most areas, it's about geopolitics, hard line, but not for climate. Do you believe that you can separate that? Is that what this would lead you? Your let's say, conceptual framework, would it lead you to think that one can handle those two issues, one by confrontation and the other one with cooperation?
Very good. Okay, so let me first apologize for being a bad chair. So we are technically almost out of time, but this was so great in all three cases that I didn't want to cut people off. So we will simply, by fiat, I will extend our time by 10 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Now, on how we're going to proceed. So I have one question for Paul, which is loosely related to some points that were made by the discussants and also particularly to Andre's question. So I will ask it, then I would ask Paul to answer jointly my question and whatever he wants to take up from the discussion, and particularly try to answer Andre's final question. We will then go to the floor and online, maybe collect a couple more questions, and then final round of answers. Very good. So my question is, if you could maybe get a little more into the connection between the political theory that you're applying and the implications for international organizations. So the broad sense that was made clear by your presentation, is made clear by the book, is that you think that international organizations that are too top-down and presumably too independent will fail both the legitimacy test and by not really being able to handle an increasingly fractured geopolitical membership, right? So they need to somehow adapt or change from that position. So my questions are twofold. First, to the extent that international organizations at this point are too top-down or too independent, so you mentioned, excessive judicial authority, you mentioned excessively independent or perhaps ambitious managing directors. Is this something that is hardwired into them, or is this something that can be corrected with practice? I mean, that's, I think, a really important question, because constitutional reform of these international organizations is extremely difficult. So whether we can fix the problem that you analyze just by changing internal praxis, or by whether we have to completely throw them out or allow them to become irrelevant, that would make a very big difference. And then my second question is specifically on this issue of judges. It would seem to me that any organization that centers around a set of rules that are agreed by treaty, and that may not just include, universalist, heavy-handed, ambitious organizations such as the WTO, which arguably have sort of a little bit of the Kantian spirit in them, but it would also include regional trade arrangements, for example, just standard free trade arrangements between countries that all have arbitration rules in them. So how far do you want to push this point that in the more complicated geopolitical present, we cannot, independent judges go too far? Because if you push it quite far, it seems to me this basically means killing, maybe not most treaties, but a whole bunch of treaties, and maybe go much further in a sense, negating the possibility of important forms of international corporations than maybe you want to go. So that is my question. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you all very, very much. Two quick comments before I forget. The first is in response to Rosa. I had hoped to, actually wrote the first couple of drafts of a chapter on Europe in the context of my book, and I threw it out because of reasons of length. Hard to believe, given that it's still so long, but there are. The second is, I should have said this earlier, but I didn't. Andre's book with Petros Mavridis on the WTO and China is the best book you are going to read on the WTO and China. And the citations in my book go on a long way, and I don't cite a whole load of other things that I read and didn't think were so useful. And I think I've read just about every serious piece on the WTO and China, and it is, in my view, for what it's worth, I'm not a trade expert, it is the best book, which took a frustrating long time to arrive from London to Zoot when it came out because of Brexit. In response to your question, so in any regime, actually, in the EU with the ECJ, in the United States with the Supreme Court, you have some high-level body of rules, and you have judges to kind of apply them, including to be guardians in some respects of constitutional level rules. But there's a difference when actually you can't change those rules. So to the extent that some of the United States problems over the past 30 years or more, certainly the past 10 years, are rooted in that constitutional change has become impossible through the mechanisms set out in the Constitution. So instead the Supreme Court does it. And I think the Supreme Court regularly finds themselves out of their depths, frankly, as men and women and as a collective. And I think the same goes, whereas in Europe hasn't quite reached the point, or the EU hasn't quite reached the point where treaty amendment and new treaties are impossible. And that's tremendously important for the role of the ECJ. One can feel much more comfortable with the role of the ECJ if it is possible for the member states, as the member states, to say, well, actually, we now want to do this treaty thing that rejigs things without changing any backward-looking decisions. Because of the veto power that everybody has in the WTO, whereas the United States slipped into a problem that Madison and Hamilton didn't anticipate, that problem is inscribed into the design of the WTO. And as a former policymaker, I just wouldn't score that design very highly. I mean, they should have thought about that. And going to one of Andre's questions, I mean, in a sense, quite apart from the gravity of the geopolitical challenge, I think it means that not necessarily a two-tier system, perhaps in the way you mean, but that subcultures through regional trade agreements, the Pacific Agreement, this trade agreement is kind of where an awful lot of the action will be and where norms will get, new norms, I don't mean social norms now, but kind of policy norms get thrashed out. And there will be tension in that given the scale of China's involvement in world trade. But I don't think China's, the scale of its involvement in world trade means, and you're not implying it means, that we should say, well, then overdependence is inevitable and we should accept that. I think we should absolutely not accept overdependence so long as we think, or the people in power think, that China really might represent a threat to our way of life, to our kind of the basics in our way of life. I'm going to come back to international organizations in a second. On Rosa's points, I wanted to say two things about Europe and the United States. For Europe, because of the geopolitics, it means that Europe should have a very high threshold for wanting to displace the dollar, however irritating Washington sometimes is in its excessive zeal in using the dollar as a weapon, and that is essentially because we import our security umbrella from them. And even if everybody gets up to 2%, we are still going to be importing our security umbrella from them. But this goes the other way too. Beijing's policy towards Europe is essentially divide and rule. They are quite open that they prefer bilateral negotiations. I've heard them say it. The Belt and Road agreements tend to be with individual states. Hungary comes to mind, but not only them. The United States has occasionally fallen into divide and rule. That was the Trump administration, I think, did a good job at identifying China. But in terms of Europe, its attitude was, well, we don't like, Brexit's a terrific thing, and Europe, the EU is very irritating. And I went around Washington saying to people, that is Beijing script. So your policies, this actually goes to what Rose is talking about. You may not agree with me on the substance, but you've got one policy towards Beijing, you've got another policy towards Europe. They do not fit together. And that's the kind of thing which I think didn't matter very much for about 30, 40 years, and now it does. On international organizations, I think it's both. I don't see any means of shifting the constitution of the WTO. I wouldn't, in the IMF, in the current state of things, give China a bigger quota. But nevertheless, I think there are things that certainly the leadership of the IMF and the WTO could do to actually, of course, slightly narrow their approach to things. To give a very parochial example, when the UK had this completely stupid budget snafu a few months ago, the IMF leader came out and said, this is an appalling budget, it's very bad for inequality, and it means monetary policy is going to be tighter. Well, the second was obvious. On the first, what the hell has that got to do with them, even if one agrees? And this was the same instinct that caused the IMF under Kondasu to overreach in Indonesia, which is, my country's still got a functioning democracy and can address its inequality problems itself, and Christina doesn't need to. What they should have said is, pretty damn stupid budget if you haven't got a fiscal framework. You're going to need a fiscal framework. We look forward to discussing your fiscal framework with you. That would have been sticking to the mandate. I've said this before in the States.
They may have said that.
Sorry?
Might have said that as well, no?
Yeah, well, I would have said, don't say the first two things, and do say the third thing. And that was my thought within 30 seconds of seeing what was said. And somebody said to me, is it so easy? And I wrote out a line, and they said, oh, yeah. It is that easy. Sometimes.
On to our audience. You had a question or a comment? No? Any comments? Yes. Can you please identify yourself? Sorry.
Hello? Yeah. Dan Michaels with the Wall Street Journal here.
Very good.
Sort of picking up on Rosa's point about geopolitics versus geoeconomics. And coming closer to home, you talk a lot about China, but the war in Ukraine. If you look at the EU's initial response, it was much more economic than geopolitical. Sanctions, but they're still dragging their feet on the defense side of things. To your point just now about the security umbrella, but also to Rosa's point about the EU being willing to flex its muscle in certain areas. Do you take should we say, a glass half full view of this, that at least the EU is willing to flex some muscle, or is this a sign of the weakness of the EU, that the best it could do was use its economic power, but with this omnipresent security umbrella, they still can't flex geopolitical and military muscle? Thanks.
Maybe just check if there's anyone else from the floor. Otherwise, on Slido, and by the way, the Slido code is #global. Let me maybe pick one, but this is really optional, I think, because it gets us into the weeds. How much does the book interact with the English School of International Relations Scholarship? It does, I know that. And anything about this solidarist versus pluralist debate, universalism versus diversity. I thought it's interesting, but you may not have much time to get to get to it. And then there is one question which I think may be as much for Andre as for you, and so if Andre wants to come in on that, he should. If the EU wants to preserve the multilateral trading system, this is by Pavel Zerka, what should be its main tools, allies, and tactics, and how to resist great power pressures from the US? So we'll end it here. Maybe actually, since I want you to have the final word, Andre, do you have any immediate comment on that question? It would take us too far. No? Okay, so it's all yours.
On the English school, thanks for asking. It addresses the English school, I hope, in some depth. It's more at the pluralist end of English school than solidarist end of English school. I'm sorry if that passes everyone by, but somebody was interested. So I don't think I'm either half full or half empty. I think it's good, to put it mildly, that the EU was prepared to use its geoeconomic might to be aligned with the United States and my country in addressing Ukraine. I think going beyond that, I think it's more a matter of member states than the EU itself. I'm going to say something that's quite difficult to say. My generation, I was born in 1958, we were brought up in the shadow of the war. It is hard to be anything other than full of admiration for the way that Germany, Deutschland, has navigated its way away from the horrors of the middle of the 20th century. But I think this episode has revealed something that had never occurred to me before, which is such is the commitment, this may be true in Japan as well, I'm not sure, such is the commitment to a kind of form of pacifism given the horrors of the past, that I think Germany, and perhaps some Germans, find it difficult to identify where the line is that actually sacrifice is worthwhile, that actually, I don't want to rest too much on ideas of a just war and of natural law, but my country is confident about those things, and I think it's actually just a product of our history that we feel that. I don't think it's anything to do with virtue in our culture or anything like that. It helps being an island, for goodness sake. But we see this as a terrible incursion, and that we should support it, and that, ultimately, without escalating it, people should be prepared to die, and certainly we should be prepared to spend resources on helping Ukraine fend away this terrible threat. And I think that's just turned out to be more difficult for Germany. We've seen some steps this week. But in that sense, I think it's all quite useful. I thought that, and I adjusted this bit of the book right at the end, when it was in proofreading almost, I had thought Putin would wait until if and when she or she's successors moved against Taiwan. I thought that would be smart. It would stretch the West in two different theaters. I thought the West was not prepared for that, which actually I think was true. And I think that's perhaps even why weren't they prepared for that? In a sense, Putin has given away a lot of optionality for Xi and Xi's successors. And I think that is of major, major significance. And within that, there is this debate in Germany about kind of what kind of power is it right to be. And I think that is of profound significance, even though some weeks over the past year have been tremendously frustrating with policymakers in Berlin. Can I answer one final question, which is, PRC challenging the West premise seems to be assuming their provocative one here. PRC didn't start the trade war or the one carriers off US waters. Well, document number 9 is some years before any signs of a trade war. The stance towards Taiwan predates that. The events in Xinjiang province, which I was lucky enough to travel through many, many years ago, predate that. And one way of thinking about this is that there's a judgment that has to be made. There's no dodging these judgments. If a country treats its own people like that, how would they treat us if they could? Now, it doesn't mean that they would. I mean, as Europeans, I was brought up in a world that didn't like the way that the United States treated many, many of its own citizens, but it didn't make them a threat towards us. And so So we didn't approve, we couldn't change it, but we didn't think they represented a threat to us. With China, you have to reach this balanced view. I think the book sets out, and the questioners simply may not agree. I think China may be a threat to us. It would be a mistake to base policy that they couldn't possibly be a threat. There are lots of papers, what does China want? In one sense, China can't possibly know what it wants. What we know is that China is going to become more and more powerful, and powerful countries tend to want more and more as they become more powerful. That was true of my country. It was true of the Dutch Republic. It was true of the French Empire. It was true of the United States. And it would be, let me finish on this note. I think that the view that prevailed in Washington and many European capitals in the 90s and early zeros, that economic liberalization would lead almost certainly to political liberalization, was an example of wishful thinking. It was not crazy to think that it would, because plainly it could have done. It was a grave mistake to put all our chips on it. And I would say, given what happened in 1989, and some friends of mine were in the square, that it was obviously a mistake to put all of our chips on that. That doesn't make anything easy in consequence, but I do think that spirit ran through Washington and some other capitals during that period. And now, as we recalibrate, we've got to, I think, where I agree with the questioner on this, we mustn't appear so hostile to China that we do find ourselves in a security dilemma vortex that brings us to the brink of collapse. And the very final thought is that this is very much Rosa's sphere. As I understand it, there aren't de-escalation protocols, and not de-escalation protocols between Washington and Beijing, of the kind that existed between Moscow and Washington. The world would be a safer place if there were de-escalation procedures. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for letting me talk about all sorts of things.
Amen. So on de-escalation protocols and many other things that you said. So again, the book is called Global Discord, and it's probably available at this point in most of the countries that our listeners may be from. Thank you so much to Paul, Rosa, and Andre, and we close this event. Thank you.